avoid, as my grandmother used to say, trying to teach my grandmother how to suck eggs, and just talk a little bit about what's happening in some other industries that have faced kind of bottlenecking challenges. I don't have to go over all of the challenges that you guys are facing right now. You know them better than I do. In a lot of ways, drug development seems to have plateaued. It's getting harder to find new targets. The regulatory barriers are higher. And now you've got this gigantic new healthcare law, which may be good, may be bad for drug discovery. I won't offer an opinion on that. But either way is going to make things a little bit different. And so how do you think about going forward in a really tough environment like this? I think the question that we opened with, what will Google do, is kind of an interesting one, because Google has managed to be such an incredibly innovative company. And one of the ways that they do this is what I think of as sort of classic web mentality. So this is what I'm going to be talking about, is that they, for example, all of their employees have an 80-20 arrangement where they spend 80% of their time working on one thing. They spend 20% of their time working on something else, some kind of fun side project that they've started. If it goes long enough, they can get approval. This is where things like Google Finance and Gmail, these started as side projects for other people. But that, that's obviously, that sounds sort of like business book kind of think different 20% of the time. And that's really, it's really important, but it's important in a couple of different ways. The first is that if anyone's read Stephen Johnson's new book on innovation, which I highly recommend, he talked about this idea of the adjacent possible. Basically, the way that innovation happens is it's a chaotic process, but it's a sort of orchestrated chaos. It's sort of like a symphony orchestra, right? Everyone's kind of doing their own thing, but then it all comes together at the end and makes this amazing sound. What the 80-20 thing does is bring new ideas into your other projects. So most Google 80-20 projects don't go anywhere. They turn out to be stupid and they get killed. One of my friends, for example, who works at Google, spent actually a surprising amount of time programming a Mac Mini to display how many hits your web page had gotten. So you could go in and type your web page in, and it would tell you how many people liked you. This didn't really go anywhere, and it would do this dynamically. So the idea was companies could show how many people were reading the Pfizer website. And it didn't turn out to be such a good idea, and they killed it. But that's actually really, really important. One of my favorite stories about invention is Thomas Edison. Many people are not aware, he was actually trying to invent the electric light bulb kind of on a deadline. And so as he was getting close to this deadline, he tried over and over again. He had competitors. There was prize money involved. So as he's getting fairly close to his deadline, a reporter tracks him down in his little barn in New Jersey and says, "Mr. Edison, how does it feel to have failed?" And Thomas Edison said, "What do you mean failed? I have discovered 10,000 things that do not make a good filament for an electric light bulb." And now, that sounds kind of dumb, but in fact, Thomas Edison was frequently criticized for being this just brute force idiot. He often didn't have a good theory behind what he was doing. Instead, he just tried stuff. He just kept trying filaments. Finally, he found carbonized bamboo. And it kind of came to him one night as he was walking past someone's garden, and he went in and tried it, and that turned out to be a thing that worked. But he wasn't good at kind of formulating a good theory, moving towards it, carefully eliminating the possibilities. He was basically just kind of like a hacker attack. I'm going to try 10,000 passwords on this website and see if I can get one of them through. But that's actually a surprisingly effective way to work. And it's funny if you look back at the old movies about medicine, which some of you may have watched when you were kids, right? There's Dr. Kildare in his lab. And God knows what he's inventing, right? There's no way. But a lot of drug discovery happened like that early in the 19th century, right? In the 19th century, early in the 20th century. People had no idea what they were doing. They just kind of went in, mixed up some chemicals, drank them, saw what happened, occasionally died, and occasionally discovered life-saving drugs. Now, obviously, you had things like aspirin derived from willow bark and so forth. But to a surprising amount, they were stumbling around in the dark. So what I'd like to argue today is that a little bit of stumbling is a good idea. You don't want to be totally theory-free. You don't want to be just kind of blindly firing arrows and hoping that one hits the target, or doing what, the famous story about the guy who has all of his arrows are bullseyes, and someone asked him how he learned to be such a good shot. And he said, "Oh, I'm not a good shot. I just draw a bullseye around the arrow once I've hit somewhere." But a little bit of that So I want to talk about how you get an evolutionary mindset and how you think about, think about all of the biological things that we do. You are the most incredible, complicated computer on the planet, and you have all of these insanely specialized modules, which is why you have people who, if they have some sort of like brain disease, right, suddenly they can't tell that they have a left hand. You can see the left hand, everyone else can see the left hand. They just can't get their body to acknowledge that it's here. That's because your body, over millions and millions and millions and millions of years, has gone from a single-celled amoeba to having eyes and all of these complicated parts of your brain and a spleen and all of these other bits that I'm not really sure what they do. So how do you bring that into your work? So I want to talk about how failure works and how it doesn't. It's really common to talk about like the freedom to fail and how it's important to be willing to fail. You have to be willing to fail. You have to be willing to take risks. We all know about that, right? Obviously. But in fact, what really matters is not just willingness to fail, but how you handle the failure. So there's a great study there's a consultancy that goes out and does these sorts of studies where they get people to build a structure out of spaghetti. It's one of these group building exercises. Some of you may roll your eyes, but the odds that they give you 25 strands of spaghetti, and in your team you say build the tallest structure that will support an egg. And so interestingly, like engineers, unsurprisingly, do pretty well at this. MBAs are the absolute worst group. I say this as the proud holder of an MBA, because they apparently spend all of their time arguing about who's going to be in charge of building the spaghetti tower. But one of the interesting things is that kindergartners do really well at this. They're like on the high end of group performance. So why is this? There's a couple reasons. The first is that the kindergartners, they don't know what the rules are. Like, unlike us, right, someone gives us 25 strands of spaghetti, we say, I have 25 strands of spaghetti. The kindergartners go and ask for more spaghetti. None of the adults ever do this. So, like, just from the beginning, they have an advantage because they've got 9 times as much spaghetti. But what do they do with it? But what they do with this spaghetti is really interesting. They have no plan. The kindergartners just start putting strands of spaghetti together. And they get something that holds an egg this high, and then they start building on top of that. And they just keep trying, they just keep making it a little bit better each time. And so because they have more spaghetti than the adults, they can take this evolutionary incremental process, right? And eventually they get to a structure that will hold an egg pretty high. Not as high as some of the engineers from Singapore, who are apparently the best performing team ever. But when you can get a kindergartner to build an award-winning, high-performance spaghetti tower, you kind of have to sit up and take notice. So, what does that mean for, like, adults who are not kindergartnners? One of the great strengths of the U.S. economy that I think is really kind of overlooked, and something that you guys are already out there doing this, right? You take some of the most incredible risks. I frankly don't know how you wake up in the morning and go to work. Because like I go out and I publish an article and it costs $5,000 maybe to report, and then it goes in the magazine. But to go out and try to develop a drug for, say, $100 billion or so that then fails in stage 3 trials, I'm really glad you invented sleeping pills. But how do you build better structures to support failure? Because it's not just about getting there. How do you build a structure that accommodates it? What happens after failure matters just as much as being willing to risk it. It may matter more, not just because it incents people, not just because it makes you better. That does matter a lot. One of the big differences between Europe and the US, if you look at people in Europe and the US, about 2/3 of people in the US have at some point considered opening their own business. Most of them don't go on to do it, but we have incredibly high rates of entrepreneurship compared to Europeans. And a lot of that has to do with failure. One of my friends was talking to a banker in Switzerland and said, why don't you guys just open up, he was actually talking to a group of bankers, why don't you just open up your own bank instead of working for these? And everyone kind of stared at him, and finally the one guy who's like the American file said, here, that's kind of like if you told me you're an 18-year-old who's going to get married. Like, I hope that works out for you, but no one thinks it's a good idea. Your family, your friends don't support it. If you're an executive who works for a firm that fails, you're done. You've pretty much managed your last major. Now, they won't let you starve. They're better, they will take better care of you than the United States will. but you will never, ever again get a position of responsibility, especially in places like Germany. The United States is the exact opposite. You go out to interview for I want to get money from a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, the first thing they want to hear is, have you run a startup and have you run a failed startup? Why is that? Because failure contains information. We all know this, right? We all know that when we look back over our own lives, the most valuable places that we learned the most, the biggest changing experiences for us were the experiences where we failed, where things went really badly wrong. And that's because failure is nature's way of saying, don't do that. And that's really good information to have. Knowing 10,000 things that don't make a good filament for an electric light bulb can actually be incredibly valuable information. Now, if you take the guy who tried 9,900 substances and you say, you are a failure, you're out of my organization, you obviously don't know what you're doing, go away, you've lost the information about things that don't make good filaments for electric light bulbs. And if you're going to go try and make an electric light bulb, that's kind of good information to have. Because not only are you not going to try those substances, you have all this data. What didn't work? How didn't it work? Why didn't it work? You can start developing theories. You can start pulling information out of those failures. So one of the reasons the United States is good at entrepreneurship is that they encourage people to take risks. But the other is that once they have taken risks, the United States is actually very good at dealing with people who have failed. So if you look at our bankruptcy system, for example, this is my favorite example because most people don't realize the United States bankruptcy system is the most generous in the world. Even after our draconian 2005 reform, or at least that's what I kept hearing from the consumer advocates when I reported on it. Even after that, our bankruptcy system is so generous that when I was describing the new system after the draconian reform to my colleagues at The Economist, they were like, oh, well, that's obviously ridiculous. Of course you need to reform that. How could you let someone just declare bankruptcy and walk away from all their debts? And I was like, no, this is the bad, hard system. What does that mean? It means that people get a fresh start, and that actually turns out to be incredibly important. In the United States, we have a really interesting little natural experiment. So our bankruptcy code is done at the federal level. Everyone declares bankruptcy under the same rules, but the rules for what you can shield from creditors vary from state to state. And so in Delaware, which has a lot of credit card companies, the Homestead Exemption, the amount of equity that you can shield from your creditors, $3,000, or at least it was at the time of the 2005 reform when I reported on this. In Florida and Texas, it's unlimited, which is why OJ tried to move there and buy this giant house. And then there's actually a clause in the 2005 reform called the OJ exception, where there are now rules about how long you have to own that house before you can declare bankruptcy. No, just generally. You can't. Dick Fuld is actually attempting to do the same thing now from Lehman. So what it actually turns out is that the larger the Homestead Exemption, the higher the rates of entrepreneurship. And why is that? Two reasons. First, because it's a lot easier to take a risk if you're not going to lose your house, if you're not going to pull the roof from over your kids. But second of all, because that means capital. That means that once you fail, you can try again. You can take that information out. Most entrepreneurs, you would like to think that there's some big plan that successful entrepreneurs are likely to do it again. 70% of people who've started a successful first company fail the second time around. It's really, really hard. It's like Hollywood, as William Goldman said, the reason that they make bad movies, they don't know. And businesses are the same way. You just can't predict American opinion and well enough to know that you've got a sure thing. It's never a sure thing. And in that environment, letting people start over. And so let me talk about a few of the principles by which I think our bankruptcy code and a lot of other American institutions do this before I close up. The first is that it has to be quick. You recognize that a failure has happened early. It means you should be trying more things. You throw out a bunch of this is what Google does. They throw a bunch of stuff out there, they monitor it really intensely, and then they pull the stuff that doesn't work. And so when we're talking about medical data, that's a big opportunity, actually, I think, when you talk about the current trends, current policy. In fact, you're going to be getting a huge flood of data, not just from the medical records, which is going to be huge with what the Obama administration has done, but because we're getting better technology for doing diagnostics, for monitoring compliance. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I am the leading cause of antibiotic resistance in the United States. And so just making sure that patients take their pills, But we're also getting ways to crunch numbers better. IBM has got, to go back to looking at customized medicine, IBM now has a working website where clinicians can go, and you can input the DNA signature of the HIV virus, and you can tailor, and you can see their real-time crunching data to see which cocktails are working against which viral DNA signatures, and they're giving that drug to clinician real time. Second thing, you've got to let go of sunk costs. Once it's happened, it's happened. The biggest thing that you get with bankruptcy in the United States is just people say, but it's not fair, right? They borrowed the money, they ought to pay it back. Well, bankruptcy is a recognition that you can't. The bankruptcy court is not going to let you walk away from debt unless your assets and your income no longer match up. And at that point, it should be quick. You let it go. You don't throw good money after bad. And this is the hardest thing to do. You guys have this problem in spades because the investments you make are so large. That decision to walk away is much harder than it is for me killing a story. So you have to be intentional about that. You have to be conscious about it. You have to think in that evolution. Evolution kills most of its experiments, right? Most genetic mutations die in the womb because they aren't viable. It's only the very, very few that survive. Salvage what you can and avoid blame. So that's getting that information out. Building a culture that says, hey, great, you failed. What'd you learn? And I know that you guys already do this. So I'm not like, again, not trying to talk, to give my incredible journalistic insights to guys who've been doing this for 20 years. But really thinking about that constantly, of really thinking about how are we evolving. And in the end, this is going to mean with the data that you have, with the ability, you now have the ability to throw more stuff out there. You're going to get more information from patients real time. You're going to probably discover more Vioxxes early, but you're also maybe going to get more Viagras, things that you just had no idea were coming until they suddenly show up late. A funny side effect turns out to be the main market for your drug. When you think about a drug like aspirin and how useful it's turned out to be for so many different conditions, you're going to have more of those opportunities. And so the follow-up, the closing thing that I would say is both throwing more things out there to see what happens, but also monitoring more intensely what's happening. And you're going to have those opportunities, but seize them. And to the extent that you can, be working with the government on this. That's an area where you guys have a real incentive to make sure that this stuff gets done right, because the policy has been set, but the execution is still very much in play. And so I will close up and I guess open us up to questions.
Thank you, Megan. If I could just offer a comment or two, I think it's really, really interesting that all five of us who spoke, with only minimal collusion in advance, basically started talking in the language of the information age, Google. Greg brought up Greg Jarvis, What Would Google Do, the well-known book. Thomas talked about sort of nuanced pricing, which you can only do with pretty heavy data crunching. Arthur talked about using the patient as a greater source of information, before and after. Megan talked about brute force searching, which is what a computer does. From Thomas Edison to a computer is a smarter version of Thomas Edison by that reckoning. And I brought up Google too. I think not surprisingly, if we live in what we're calling the information age, the metaphor, the root metaphor that we all kind of grope towards is, what are these computers doing? How do they help? What do they tell us? And so on. As a aspirational way of thinking about organizing a business, a Democratic member of Congress who was a big proponent of the health care bill told me that he'd been pushing unsuccessfully to get HHS to not create healthcare.gov, because it was the government running it, and use WebMD. He said, look, everybody loves half the people in this country go to WebMD, and it proves out. It is a well-known, well-regarded thing, and when you think about successful web operations, you don't think about the government. You think about Google. You think about Facebook. You think about WebMD. So if I could just take the prerogative of the first question to the three of you up there, and that is, if we're living in a data-rich environment where that's kind of the goal, okay, let's be as cool as Google is, let's do our stuff as neat as they do, and it works, then there's a to play Lieutenant Columbo, there's, you know, in that old TV show, there's just kind of one thing that's kind of nagging on me, and that's as he confronted the suspect, you know, who he knew was guilty, but he had 45 minutes to show left to go. So just one thing. There's a fellow named Jim Wooten out of the U.S. Chamber. He now runs an organization called Nations Courts, and his point is that all this data sharing, which we're all for, and I think we all understand it works. You know, that's the way to do it. Is just open season for the trial lawyers. He says they'll come after you on your data. They'll come after you on. So you got a report in 2010 that the patient wasn't really feeling that well when that happened to him or her, and you put that in a file. And you didn't do anything about it, and you didn't alert your superior, and so on and so on. And they'll come after the software makers who, so you were part of this process, and you got the deepest pocket. Oh, maybe the deepest pocket of all is the phone companies, along whose line this traveled from, you know, here to Pluto to back to the patient again, and so on. So I think to myself, as I think about industries and so on and that have done well and done poorly, I think, for example, that like the Federal Aviation Administration specifically intakes data from all the airlines and about crashes and performance and so on like that, and de-identifies it. They run it through a company called MITRE, a Beltway company in D.C., and the airlines don't get sued all over the place. I mean, it's a shield that's been created that has never really been penetrated, not for lack of trying. You compare that to, so in other words, the airline industry has been sort of sheltered by the FAA on exactly this issue. You know, by contrast, we can think of other industries that haven't been so sheltered, that have actually been sort of up against when the government doesn't really want them to do what they're doing. The tobacco companies come to mind. Frankly, the energy industry comes to mind. It's not easy to build a new power plant anywhere. They're just shutting one down here, or about to stop one from being built just here in Maryland, a nuclear power plant. So maybe you could help us think through, from a historical and political point of view, what is it when an industry is favored and can proceed with the plan I think we all would kind of agree is a good one, and what happens when it's not favored, and then what do you do about it?
One thought I had, which is that regulation in some sense would push you towards patient-centered information, which is what was discussed here, in the sense that there's enormous price pressure on companies like Pfizer, and presumably, therefore, one would be interested in expanding quantity as opposed to raising prices, and adherence is the prime candidate for that. I think it's very valuable information on the patient level that couldn't be gotten by centralized information, like claims data tells you nothing about why people don't adhere or not. And I think you kind of have to get that from the patient level. There's sort of surveys out there trying to get at this, obviously, but and there have been some economists have not done, I think, enough work. There's been some discussion of how much of non-adherence is non-response, for example. That would be a very natural reason to not adhere. But we don't really know that because we don't really have the patient-level data, which would be extremely valuable. So the decentralized data by the patients that doesn't show up in claims data. Claims data is deficient for several reasons. Two of the primary ones I've argued is they lack health outcomes many times, and that's what we're really interested in, to connect with the resource use. And second, they don't have the patient sort of surveys attached to them, and therefore, you know, we have all other kinds of, you know, panels that we produce to overcome the deficiencies by claims data. But I think essentially the price pressure that is coming from deregulation would motivate a greater investment in patient-centered sort of data on adherence.
So just one thought on this, which is the sort of an active policy of avoiding producing certain kinds of data about your product in the market or trying to certify it as invalid. which is the fundamental strategy of the tobacco industry for decades, is not a shield from liability. So that, to say, well, each time you in any way participate in generating a report of an adverse reaction, you become liable. Trying to actively non-certify those as valid or trying to just pretend they don't exist is in no way a shield. So, at some point, there's no solution to the conundrum you point out from a firm perspective, short of a semi-catastrophe as we had with the vaccine sector, where it took an act of Congress to then create a kind of collective pool from which injured parties could get some compensation. I personally feel like that's exactly what we should do with prescription drugs, so that when people are injured by adverse reactions, as opposed to either winning the lottery through some multi-million-dollar settlement or getting next to nothing, they get some fairly predetermined payout that's based on the injury they suffered. But that's kind of sidestepping where I think this overall forum is going. So I would say, fundamentally, I agree with Tom. You ought to generate more of this data, and you can't let fear of liability stop you from going in this direction.
I would say, assuming all policy, I quite agree that the liability system, especially for things like medicine, it's not necessarily the best way to handle these problems. I remember actually, in a slightly unrelated thing, talking to a friend who's a SEC lawyer, and she said, you have no idea how hard it is to try these trials. Sorry, she's a securities lawyer. She litigates against the SEC, and she said, you have no idea, because the jury doesn't understand. And if you try to explain it to them, they hate you because it's really boring. This is mostly people who elected not to go get MBAs in finance. And I said, well, how do they, and sometimes lawyers don't understand. I said, well, how do they decide the cases? She's like, no one really knows. And there's a lot of that going on in medical malpractice and drug cases too. I think that when you look at the Vioxx cases and what happened to them on appeal, it's really instructive that you guys are in a really tough place. But that said, I also agree that I don't think that generating the data, first of all, a lot of the data you want is not data that's going to come from you. It's going to be getting data from other people. So what you really have to worry about is their litigation concerns. Because the post-release data on patients is the stuff you want is the observational stuff from physicians' offices. Who came in complaining about chest pains 6 months after who suddenly had their diabetes improve after they took your new liver drug or whatever. Those are the things that you're going to want to see. But also, it's not going to be a shield. The supply of medical lawsuits is roughly controlled by the supply of excess lawyers. So you might divert some of them from you. There's actually apparently data on this that it roughly you have a lot of unemployed lawyers. You get a lot of personal injury lawsuits. So you can't hide by not producing the data. They will come find you anyway. And the data, as much as it can be, it can give them something to troll through, it can also be your best friend, because the more data you have, the more you have when you're going into court.
Okay. Well Greg, you want
the concept of continuous improvement is one that every other industry gets to do. So if you're making an iPod or you're making a car, you get a lot of feedback. If you're making a hotel, you can go on to Second Life virtual world, get feedback before you even build it, and so you can continually improve it. So here, Jamie, hold this microphone. Make yourself useful. This is an example of continuous improvement for Pfizer. Do you all see this ad today? Do you see this ad today? It says that Aricept 23 mg may be better for you than Aricept 10 mg. Now, first off, nobody knows what mg is. And the good news is we were able to say this in public. The bad news is we have to say it with all this other stuff in there in which the words vomit, diarrhea, and nausea occur far more than this may help you. Now, since we're talking about what we can do internally and not how to change the ad, so to speak, the fact that we are trying to continuously improve the benefit to people of using this drug in Alzheimer's is a really good thing. And the fact that we can actually tell them we had a clinical study that showed some continuous improvement. The question is how do we use the patient data that groups like Jamie's create and that we get from our own study to continuously improve our drugs, our product, in an environment where the government requires us to do things in a more seriatim fashion. We can't do it continually. We have to do it in phases. So how do we internally balance the need to improve our medicines as we on a year-by-year basis when our system is keeping us from doing continual? We have to do it through, start over every time you want to add a new quality, so to speak.
Gotcha. Wonderful. Thank you. Now it's your turn. Any questions you might, you might have. I got this microphone. I don't need this one. But you do. So who wants to go first? Okay. Yes, sir.
Hello there. Just thinking about user-led innovation, which I think is a very interesting concept. I think we have done that historically, but we've done that mediated through doctors. So doctors have fed back information about new innovations, new uses of medicines that we've launched. And doctors have also, as Megan mentioned, provided us with some information about what the patients say about, oh, they had backache, they had this side effect. So our business model has been mediated around doctors really clearly. And if we move towards a business model that's mediated around patients, that's kind of a step because we have to leave some people behind who have been kind of our friends and then kind of not our friends. It's a bit of an odd relationship, arguably. But it's changing who the point of contact is. And the only analogy I could really think of in that is in the food industry, where the company's producing, and we do some of this, we sell medicines to farmers to improve their beef production or improve their pork production. We sell to farmers and we get feedback from farmers about what they're using our products for, rather than the people eating the food. So I'm English, and this happened to us in a big way with GM crops, where companies like Monsanto were selling to farmers, selling something they really wanted, but not what people wanted to eat. So I'm just wondering, is that a kind of analogy which works, that we're bypassing an intermediary, and that has some risks, it has some good things, but who else has done that, apart from farmers? Who else has successfully bypassed a group that they're traditionally built around?
Well, I think a lot of industries have disintermediation has been, in a lot of ways, the big story of the last 20 years, 30 years. But what you have is a fairly unique problem, right? When I wanted to go buy books from Amazon, I didn't have to I didn't have a law saying that I actually really had to go to Barnes & Noble. And what has happened, GM is actually probably the closest analogy. They had to go through bankruptcy to close dealers. They were not legally allowed to close their dealer networks because the auto dealers had been incredibly wealthy, and they're like the biggest donors to local political campaigns. And so the state legislatures had all passed laws saying you just legally can't. You can't close a dealer. You can't break these agreements. You guys have an issue where, when you look, obviously I'm not saying that doctors aren't useful, but if you look at something like birth control pills, well, what does a gynecologist know how to do? She knows how to ask you if you're over 35 and smoke. And that's what she does. There's no reason you have to go to a gynecologist except that allows them to force women to come in for pap smears. And so doctors are incredibly reluctant to let go of even minor prescriptions, right? Taking something off label is really difficult, bypassing that intermediary. And when I talk to doctors about this, because I'm generally considered like a pro-pharma blogger, and I get a bunch of doctors who are like, damn these pharma commercials, because now people coming in and ask for drugs. And then the doctors will say, and then I have to, the reason that so many Me Too not good drugs get prescribed is that this advertising. As if the doctor is completely powerless in the hands of the patient and is unable to say, no, you really don't need Nexium, Prilosec works fine. Somehow that they think that advertising like brainwashes. And what it really is that doctors, when they feel any of their power slipping, they don't want to confront their patients. They like the model of the guy in the white coat who gets to say, like, do this, don't do that, and doesn't get a lot of dialogue with the patient. That's the easiest way, especially with all the pressure they're under from insurers, to both cut down on expensive prescriptions and make their doctor visits about 30 seconds long, which is why you get this visible, like, okay, you talk and then get out kind of feeling from a lot of your doctors. And the way that they resist that is often legislative. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge that you face, is simply that, like, they have the power to go to the FDA, to pressure people to keep things from going off label, to keep things very much in their hands, to keep advertising cut down, anything that challenges their power. However, there's a lot of pressure being put on them now as well, because they are the cost center. They're like, what everything always comes back to is, you know what? What's really costing is not waste, fraud, and abuse. It's we're paying for stuff, we're paying for procedures, and doctors are the ones who control that. And so as they're under pressure, I think it may go one of two ways. Either their power will just be abated. Ultimately, there will be a showdown between them and sort of the regulatory powers that be, in which case you guys are going to have a big opportunity to come forward and say, not for everything, but for the things where it makes sense for patients to be more involved in these decisions, to get some of that power cut back. And then the second thing, though, is that if they win, they're probably going to manage to take even more of that. So
I want to have a quick comment, and then I know Tom does as well. So I thought that was a great question, and the analogy that popped into my mind from another sector had to do with the fact that if you walk into a Walmart, and aside from the food section, like 95% of every product in that store is made by a commodity chemical company. So a Dow, a BASF, or a DuPont. None of it's branded such. And in fact, there's been 3 or 4 companies in the interim, in the middle part of the production chain, that did a lot of work on the fundamental molecule to make it into that plastic toy that you're buying for your children. The chemical companies in recent years have become very aware of the fact that if they rely solely on the purchasers, the primary purchasers of their products, they will miss out on significant changes happening at that retail point of purchase. And so they've done a huge amount of work to understand the customer of their customers without disintermediating their primary customers. You don't actually have to do both, in my mind. We see it in some sectors where you do the full disintermediation, but you don't have to. And the existence, for example, of biodegradable plastics, which are sold by volume at like 1/100% of all the other kinds of plastics, is in part related to the fact that these large firms built project teams around molecules that they knew would not have huge sales, but nevertheless were able to incentivize internally the sales force, who weren't now selling by the 1,000-ton volume, but like 10, 20, 30 tons at a time, in order to push some new innovative products through. So that's the analogy that comes to my mind.
I have another analogy, which be, well, in my general question would be, or answer would be, when you go to one or the other, I think it depends on what you want to learn. Obviously, if you want to learn about compliance, you don't go to doctors. But if you want to learn about why reimbursement affects doctors, you go to doctors. So, but the general issue, I think, is generally, you know, when you have intermediaries, such as informed intermediaries, or licensed to be informed intermediaries in healthcare, when they get cut out, it's usually because of price reductions attracting people. You cut the intermediary out, and therefore you can reduce prices. So the model for that, an example, you know, financial markets, we have the Ameritrades now. Before you had brokers, now you just do it yourself on the internet. The reason they do that is because you can lower the price of the trade. We can't, that's infeasible to do with prescription medicine. You can do it with OTC, and you can actually, in your strategic decision to go to OTC, you can essentially think about what are the advantages of targeting patients versus doctors in your either campaigns or whatever. But I think that's for the set of drugs where you're on the margin between OTC and prescription, that's something that you should kind of think through. It's an avenue to think through, I think. But, you know, if it's clearly prescription, by law, we can't cut out the middleman like other industries.
Yeah, I think the issue of disintermediation, you know, also known as cutting out the middleman, is a fascinating one. The advertisement that Greg held up, you know, it's the power of DTC, obviously. When's the last time anybody in this room met a banker? Or when's the last time a journalist ever met an editor? Next question.
Thanks. You talked about the value or the acceptable return to innovators, and you gave a couple of different examples on value return to innovators. Sometimes there's a difference in perception around what is an acceptable value return to innovators. How do we get at a societally acceptable return of value to innovators?
Well, I think there's several aspects of that. One is that what we're currently doing, I think it's misleading, and actually we didn't do it right either, or fully. We couldn't with the data we had. But we want to look at the full value of the innovation, which what that means is that the patent life of that innovation may not be capturing. It has the most value essentially when it goes off patent, because that's when prices come down and patients get more value for their dollar in some sense. Obviously, that's generated by the initial innovator. But if you look at the life or the whole span of the drug, many times, the generic part of the life cycle is the highest value component of the innovation. Now the question is, how do you bring that? What's the cost of capital, and what's the return you get on that cost of capital? But you're going to have, as you see in pipeline decisions all the time, things that are on the margin. We have a certain cost of capital. We have to hit that with our the size of the prevalence of the disease, or how much payers are going to be attracted to this drug over other competing drugs in the class, whatever. But that's the margin you're going to end up with. And when you have this low appropriation of value, such as 7%, many times you're going to abandoning things that, you would have accepted at, let's say, 15% appropriation, and still having 85% value to the consumers being delivered. So it's a balance between essentially what's your cost of capital, and many times pharmaceutical firms are different from other industry because they do a lot of financing of the R&D from internal, basically retained earnings, as opposed to going to capital markets to get new R&D spending. So you see revenues of the industry following, being highly correlated over time with R&D spending, which in a perfect world it wouldn't be, because R&D projects would come up, and it doesn't matter if our current projects are earning a lot less or more. We shouldn't be financing depending on how past innovations are performing. But because of that, there's mainly two problems in the pharmaceutical industry. One is there's very low appropriation of the value generated to patient, and two, their cost of capital is all screwed up, because you basically have capital markets that don't understand what they're doing and therefore demand a premium on the capital to actually lend it to the company, a premium high enough to make it valuable for the company to use their retained earnings instead of going to capital markets. So there are kind of two fronts. I've talked about one front being the appropriation, but there's an equally important thing to think about for a company like Pfizer. How do you make your R&D investment not be so dependent on past successes, which is essentially what you're doing when you're financing through retained earnings. And basically that you can get a lower cost of capital from people to lend to you, so you don't have to always go into or scrap projects just because, Merck scrapped a bunch of R&D projects because of Vioxx. That shouldn't happen. Those R&D projects were equally valuable whether or not Vioxx failed. And that cycle, or the correlation between earnings and capital costs, I think is very, very unfortunate for this industry. So that's something that you definitely should think about.
Let me just add one quick thing to that observation, which is there's something, I'm not sure where this leads, but there's something quite ironic about funding current research out of the past successes, but the other irony has to do with pricing current drugs on the promise of future successes. So when I buy an automobile, I don't shop around and decide which one I'm going to buy based on what the models will look like in 5 years. And yet the pharma industry quite successfully, and actually quite reasonably, has pitched to the public policy that we price the drugs way above the cost of making and distributing them because we invest in research for future drugs. So a piece of the trap you're describing is actually an intentional public policy move by the industry.
And I'll just add that I think that, again, I think pharma is in a slightly unique position. There's an economist, Robin Hanson, who says that a lot of healthcare is about demonstrating that we care. And we talked earlier about the people freak out when they think about money and health together. And so the fact that, ironically, the better your drugs are, the bigger your PR problem is. And the bigger and the harder it is to get money back from it, which is a very strange, but it literally, because I write a lot about pharmaceutical development and so forth, and the conversations I have with readers go, well, this drug shouldn't cost so much because it's saving my life. I need it to save my life. And it's like, well, I mean, what else do you want to spend your money on? And so, and you see this in the arguments about, well, we spend 16% of GDP, we're going to spend 20% of GDP. It's pretty soon all journalism is just going to consist of mindless trend extrapolation. But when I look at that, I think, well, I've got an entire shelf in the supermarket full of things to make my towels softer. That seems like, I think we're done with towel softing and now on to spending it. What better do we have to spend on than healthcare? But it's not an intuitive thought for most people. And so pricing to capture that surplus is incredibly difficult. And you see this also, the other big area where you see this, right, is in disasters, where what you want in a disaster is, for example, after Katrina, exactly what happened should have happened. Prices on gasoline in that area shot up, and there were shortages in the rest of the country. And that was the right economic thing to happen, right? Because it draws resources into an area that suddenly lost them. It causes people who didn't really need to drive to conserve. But boy, people absolutely freak out when water goes to $5 a gallon. People scream, even though that's causing people in Alabama to pack up the truck and drive water into your area. So no, instead we cut off that price and we don't get any of it. So I think that that attempt to appropriate more surplus is always going to be really incredibly tricky for you, in part because I think Robin Hanson is right. And when we view healthcare as like a signal of our caring about other people, coupling that with a price tag is somehow really fraught as a social decision, which is why I don't think we're ever going to have an intelligent discussion about end-of-life care on either side. I mean, you also get a lot of people who are like, well, we should just pull the plug. Because if you only have 4 weeks to live, we were talking about this earlier, if you only have 4 weeks to live, a drug that extends your life by 4 weeks doubles your lifespan. That seems like a really valuable drug to me, but that isn't the way that people are comfortable thinking about it.
Thank you. I have probably a comment and a question for each of the points that were made earlier. The first one, with respect to drug pricing, I don't know if you can remember way back in the early 1990s when we were looking at Zithromax first entering the market as azithromycin antibiotic, a macrolide antibiotic, similar in its mechanism to erythromycin. However, it had a very unique difference. It didn't need to be dosed as often. A very innovative mechanism of action. We struggled early on to try to price that product because the initial pricing that we put on it, we were told would not be reimbursable. So we lowered the cost, product uptake occurred, and as they say, the rest is history. The drug sold very well. However, the more we learned about the drug, the more we realized that we could have decreased the dosing significantly and still achieved the correct therapeutic response. In other words, Zithromax started off as being 2 pills and then 1 pill a day for 5 days to 1 pill a day for 3 days to Zmax, which we now have as a single dose, which is sufficient for most types of infections in the indication. We wouldn't have known that when Zithromax was first approved. So in other words, the value of that drug really wasn't known until it became generic, which is the way things go, obviously. But it's very difficult to know the value of a drug is going to be during initial launch. So it's sort of a conundrum. How do you appropriately price a drug, knowing that you have an innovation in your hands, where at the same time there's no real way of knowing 10 years down the road what that's going to lead to? in terms of improvement. We now know that single-day dosing is a godsend in terms of abolishing antimicrobial resistance type problem because it increases patient compliance. So there's no way of knowing that in the early 90s when azithromycin was first approved. My next comment has to do with the patient data feeding back to the patients. I mean, obviously that's something that we do. We listen to the patient's post-marketing surveillance through the physicians in a certain way. However, the quality of the data is something that I worry about because, I'll take an extreme example. If you look at vaccines and autism, you had people who were positively convinced that vaccines cause autism. They feed that data back, and it resulted in decreased vaccination rates and outbreaks of vaccine-preventable diseases. So there needs to be a way of controlling or somehow filtering the data in order to ensure accuracy so that we don't act on something that is absolutely false. And that's not some of the things that we worry about with respect to that type of work. Thomas Edison, a good example there in terms of the light bulb, looking for filament materials. But his invention was made even better because of an invention that was made years earlier with respect to vacuum, being able to draw a vacuum on a flask. And his invention didn't realize its true potential if not for a previous invention. And both those inventions were made possible through patent protection and the ability to patent those types of procedures. So that's something else to keep in mind. Oftentimes, you may have something that you don't know what it's good for. And later on, you find application. With drugs, it's the same way. But we face problems in applying previous knowledge with drug discovery. And it would feed into the point that Greg made with respect to continuous improvement. When we try to improve our drugs, what they're called evergreening or copycats, it's very difficult to take a drug that's been very, very successful, make a few molecular changes, and achieve a significant clinical difference. We do that, but oftentimes we're criticized because it's the same old type drugs. So, for every idea that's been mentioned today, the reality has shown that, yes, absolutely, it's great, but there's another side there that has to be dealt with. And it makes it very, very difficult for us to really, truly innovate because essentially in the society that we live in, risk-averse, suspicious type, big pharma versus the world type of a situation, it becomes very difficult to do our jobs. And there's some questions in there, I don't know, but these are the sorts of thoughts that occurred to me listening to the panel today.
I agree with you that as Isaac Newton said, if I see farther than other men, it's because I have stood upon the shoulders of giants. I think that pharma has often not done a good job of telling the story. I agree with you that you've got this great idea model of innovation that's completely weird. Yeah, it's Dr. Kildare goes off into his lab, and then he comes out with a cure for cancer. It's in a vial, and God knows how he formulated it, but now he's cured cancer, and we're done. And of course, that isn't anything like the way innovation happens. And that's why you hear people say, well, all the real work in pharma research is done in academic labs, as if finding a molecule that's dosable in oral, that's orally dosable, hits your target, and can pass the clinical trials without killing all the rats is not a lot of work. So I think that pharma needs to be better at telling that story. Because this is a story that I will try to explain to people, when I'm back in dialogue with my readers, because of course I get a lot of angry letters whenever I write anything about anything. This is the situational, occupational hazard of a journalist. But there are not people out there saying, hey, look, making something that you only take one pill every 3 days, it's a huge improvement. It's not trivial. And it's a story that for some reason doctors are often averse to. Marcia Engel out there writing that it's all Me Too's. But on the other hand, in fairness, you get something like Clarinex. It's kind of yeah, or Nexium, where even my gastroenterologist, I was like, shouldn't I just be taking Prilosec? He's like, left hand, right hand, take the Nexium. And so, in fairness, they do have some point, which is that some of the Me Too's are, I would say in the case of Clarinex, an active, the Hail Mary pass when all of your pipeline is sort of just totally empty. But pharma has to get out there, first of all, controlling the really terrible Me Too's, and there are a few of them out there. I see some nodding heads in the room. But also telling the story of, like, look, the small improvements are how we get to, when you look at pediatric cancer, and how it was just, like, eking out 1%, 1%, 1% over and over and over again. You guys have to be out there telling the story of how you're helping to do that.
I guess we have time for one more question.
Well, can I?
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think Tom might also.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So this is super quick. So your point about kind of misleading correlation between vaccines and autism, for example, we can come up with other examples. So I guess I would have 2 points. One is the best way to fight misleading correlation is through causation, for which you need larger N studies. And in fact, with the vaccine and autism, that's very much what's being done, right? So when you do, in fact, win this battle by gathering more information, which is absolutely what I was advocating. But linked to that, there is a certain power of the patient narrative, and I think a huge amount of people who have come to believe that vaccines cause autism do so because of something they either individually observed or the narrative of people who observed this in their children. And you need to fight narrative with narrative, which is, again, capture those records from patients. So.
I just had a comment on, I think you mentioned on how do you deal with something you don't know at launch that then reveals itself. I think that's a really important issue, not only for getting reimbursed with the right price, but also to stimulate innovation in the sense that a lot of what we worry about, or economists worry about, is sort of that you come up with a breakthrough idea, and then there's a bunch of followers that earns the money on the breakthrough idea that you came up with, in some sense. So the incentive, Bill Gates got rich not because he was the innovator. He basically perfected someone. Facebook perfected some, MySpace, whatever you have it. But essentially, the fact that you have this follow-on innovation that follows the initial innovation leads to less investment in these breakthrough ideas in some sense. And ideally, one would have sort of a dynamic cost effectiveness or dynamic assessment of these therapies where you retroactively reimburse companies. I think that's very hard to do, or convince politicians to do, or even private insurance plans to do. But ideally, one would like something like that where you saw that this was really a breakthrough drug. We don't know that at the time it's being launched. But down the road, we do know it. So if you could retroactively, therefore, reimburse as opposed to prospectively reimburse, I think there would be a lot of gains from doing that. The question is if you can convince your payers to do that, but I doubt you can.
Quick question, quick answers.
I promise a quick question rather than about the quick answers. But a question actually for Tom. You mentioned the distinction between sort of statically efficient pricing and dynamically efficient pricing, thinking about the long term versus the short term. And my question is, in the static case, we have a pretty good understanding of what constitutes efficiency. So we know that you should price at what the good costs, because if you price much higher than that, then there are people who are willing to pay the cost of production, but they can't get access. So we understand that condition. We understand what kind of market structure leads to that. We understand that a competitive market leads to that outcome. And I'm wondering if you can give us some insight about the dynamic efficiency part. What does the dynamically efficient price look like? I mean, is it the price that appropriates all the consumer surplus to the innovator? Is it somewhere in between? And also, what sort of market structures can lead to those kind of dynamically efficient outcomes? Is it one price markets? Is it price discrimination? Is it pricing with a copay for the patient? Do we have any kind of insight about what that structure looks like?
Okay, so two pieces. Generally, so the problem with dynamic efficiency is that one party undertakes the cost of R&D, i.e. Pfizer. However, many parties benefit from that R&D, i.e. patients who pay less than they value the product. So this is what economists call a positive externality, that the people who are undertaking the cost of an activity do not receive the full benefit of that activity. So therefore, most governments stimulate R&D. We don't have any government in the world to try to tax R&D. That we believe it's socially underprovided because of those reasons. Also the spillovers I talked about across firms. Now, ideally, which would never be feasible politically, you would have the person undertaking the cost receiving all the benefit. But that would mean that patient would essentially be indifferent between the innovation being on the market or not, because it's going to be priced at the value, and the innovator captures all the social value of the innovation. So practically, the question becomes essentially how much appropriation do you need, do you feel comfortable with giving firms in order to generate value? And the question is, how big are R&D costs relative to the appropriation you give? Now, what mechanism, so that could be, we know a little bit about R&D costs, what they are. We therefore want to think about for what diseases are we therefore appropriating enough or not. The mechanism to induce that is actually sort of in place. It's just a matter of price in some sense, that we have public financing. And what any subsidy does in economics is to separate what we call the demand and supply price. That's just economic jargon for what does the consumer pay versus what does the seller receive. So if you buy an iPod, Apple gets the $200 you're paying. If you're in Medicaid, Pfizer doesn't get what the patient is paying because the patient is paying nothing. So the government comes in with a subsidy, which is the difference between what the patient is paying and what Pfizer receives. So you have a wedge between the two. So you can have, by public financing, you can have a wedge that guarantees access, i.e. Medicaid patients get the drugs, but still rewards innovation, i.e. Pfizer get paid for the drug, but the innovation still has zero cost to the patient or cost-based pricing. So you could have, a nice type system. A nice type system with a price control that's high enough would essentially reward innovation sufficiently. It's just a matter of that when you get a single buyer who's the monopsony buyer, they're going to use their clout to make prices come down, and many times in an inefficient way. They become too low relative to the value of the product to innovate for it. So it's not, we have the system in place in some sense. The question is, how do you get the demand price could be zero with publicly financed healthcare, but the supply, how much do you reward innovators is just a matter of a single payer rewarding innovators, but there's so perverse incentives in having a single buyer pay a lot, okay? A single buyer never pays a lot. If you have a bunch of buyers, then you might pay a lot, but if you have a single buyer, you don't. So it's in the structure of public financing to be able to reward innovation sufficiently, but the problem is that, once you have a budget crisis, you're going to clamp down on prices.
Okay. All right. Well, in that case, I would like to thank Greg, Fran-Marie, our panel, and our audience for a lot of good questions. Thank you.
So we now have our 30-minute break, where I encourage you, if you have not checked in, please go to the front desk and check into your rooms, and be back here at 4 o'clock, and we are going to go into the next TED-style conversation. Thank you. I apologize for the late start. We had a little difficulty getting our panelists together, largely because they were enjoying the grounds, which they're supposed to do. We are now going into our second session of TED-style talks. And this group is going to challenge you with a multiple number of big ideas covering patient perspectives, FDA, CER, clinical trials, and innovation and research. And to moderate, it is my pleasure to introduce my friend, Linda Carnes. Linda has been a long-term friend of the Aspen Institute. She's participated in both of our Aspen Health Forums, and she has served as an advisor on both our stewardship project and global nutrition task. And in her real life, she's actually an executive to CDC, the Healthiest Nation Coordinating Council, where she focuses on healthcare reform. Prior to taking that post, she served as a senior advisor for public affairs at the CDC. And Linda, over to you.
Thank you very much. Give me a hand. Give me a hand. Give me a hand. Thank you. Thank you. Well, as Greg Simon shared at the outset, this is a session about transformation. I was told he has a vision for Pfizer. And here he wants us to strategize on how Pfizer can best grow and transform its business and policies in the best interest of patients. I believe in 5 years, Pfizer will be a more illuminated, energized, and patient-friendly company because it seized upon some of the policy initiatives we discussed together today. And it will be a more profitable one because of this foresight. That's what we're here for. So for the next 90 minutes, we're going to play a game. Each of our 3 panelists will present 3 key problems facing the pharmaceutical industry today. And each will present these in 10 minutes, not 11, 10 or less. And they will then present 3 key problems facing the three specific solutions to each of the problems, again in 10 minutes or less, together, the problem and the solution. These 9 big ideas will then launch what we hope will be informed, informing, and provocative exchanges with you for the balance of the session. When you return to Pfizer and begin to debrief, will you be able to develop, incorporate, implement, and realize all 9 of these? No. But you will debate all 9, seriously consider 6, perhaps select 4, probably implement 3, and most certainly 1 will be a game changer, a tipping point where Pfizer stepped up to its next level of effectiveness and performance. Our panel first is attorney Marc Boutin, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the National Health Council, Gary Puckrein, PhD, President and CEO of the National Minority Quality Forum, and Jamie Heywood, Chairman and co-founder of Patients Like Me and founder of the ALS Therapy Development Institute. And we'll start with Marc.
I actually thought I was going last, so I was not ready with the microphones. I apologize. We were asked here to come with 3 big problems and 3 big ideas, and it got me thinking about change theory. And there's a gentleman that won a very prestigious Nobel Prize for his theory on change. And I thought about it for a little while, and his theory has 2 basic components. First is that when an institution hits a point of chaos that is so troubling, it either reorganizes itself or it crumbles. And I think we're hitting a point in our environment now, in this century, where pharmaceutical industry is hitting up against that point of chaos, where it's either going to crumble or reinvent itself. That creates some really exciting opportunities. Second part of his theory is this: the change agent that will save the entity, the institution, never comes from within. It always comes from outside. It's always external. And I thought that was a really interesting observation. But for those of you in the room who don't know, Greg Simon used to be on my board of directors. He knows members of my board and my boss very well. So I couldn't just say, well, that's it, you can't do it, somebody else is going to do it to you, and go home. So I came here with 2 ideas that you need to be aware of because they're game changers that are going to impact your business in a dramatic way, and 1 request of you to be a change agent to some external stakeholders that will also impact your business. So first, flip the equation. We've heard that already today. Rather than aligning the scientific opportunity with profit, let's align scientific opportunity with the patient. What do I mean by that? Challenge in this environment is the key determining factor as to whether or not you develop a key new treatment for an unmet need is not whether or not it's a good product, it's whether or not you can get a patent. That's a real problem from a patient perspective. We're aware of tens of thousands of great treatments that have been shelved. And I can guarantee you there are great treatments at Pfizer that have been shelved that are not being developed because you don't have sufficient patent. Challenge from a patient perspective, we look at this, and again, if you have a great cure for Alzheimer's, of course you can get a patent. The reality is it may not meet the technical requirements. The person who had that discovery may have disclosed it before filing for a patent application. It may have been patented in the 50s, but never approved by the FDA due to toxicity. And even though you can address toxicity now and cure a form of cancer, you're not going to do it because you don't have a patent. And perhaps most perverse to the patient community is that when you identify a compound that you want to develop, you file a patent on it, but you also file patent applications on all the related compounds. Sometimes as many as 100,000 compounds to prevent your competition from pursuing a related product. You drop those applications, and we know that only 1 out of 2 to 10,000 products actually makes it through the FDA to market. Nobody can go back and revise those patent applications. They're lost forever. There are tens of thousands of potential treatments for unmet needs lying on the shelf. The patient community is promoting a new class of drugs called dormant therapies. These are drugs without patents but address an unmet need. We're going to secure data protection to allow you to bring these products to market. We've been working with the FDA, White House, NIH, and Congress on this issue. So clearly something that's changing in the environment, but you need to be looking through your databases, through your warehouses, identifying these compounds, starting to think about how you're going to get them to market in this new system. The next issue, it's time to hit the bullseye. Rather than targeting populations, you need to target the patient. It's no longer acceptable to make a product that only works 65% of the time. Patient community wants to know when it takes its product, it's going to work for them. That means you've got to develop the advanced diagnostics, either as companion or co-developed, that are going to predict with a level of accuracy that the product will work for them. Now, this is particularly challenging if you look at oncology. My father, in the last 2 years of his life, was on a chemotherapy agent for 18 months. During that 18 months, it turned out that the product only worked 10% of the time. He was in the 90% of the population where it didn't work. Ravaged his body, did a great deal of harm to the quality of his life, provided absolutely no clinical benefit. We live in a society where there's tremendous overuse and underuse of care. We need to figure out how we get to that point of personalized medicine. The patient community is looking at a model that would give you data protection and market protection to any sort of diagnostic company that wants to partner with you to co-develop or create a companion product for anything that's already on patent. And we would extend your patent or extend the market exclusivity for that product. Real game changers in terms of getting us to targeted therapies. Huge issue for the patient community. And oh, by the way, the patient community will stand by you and ensure that a product that serves a smaller population with accuracy has a better reimbursement rate. That's going to be a game changer. The patient community is going to be in the discussion about reimbursements within the next 2 years. Third issue. Here's where I want you to help us. It's time to catalyze patient action. Rather than supporting the patient community, which Pfizer has done a tremendous amount of work in, catalyze the patient community. It was not that long ago in the 80s when the patient community was chaining itself to the fence outside of White Oak. They were demanding new treatments for AIDS and HIV. They were saying, you need to figure out how to get these products to market. We're not going to rely solely on death as an endpoint. You need to do a better job. You look at somebody with Alzheimer's, diabetes, you look at the neurologic conditions and the autoimmune conditions, you look at rare disorders. You know what? Those people are suffering the same fate. And the level of frustration is growing. It's getting palpable. Patient community cut its teeth in advocacy by doubling the funding for NIH. We naively thought we were going to get double the treatments. Didn't happen. Guess what? We're looking at the end of the process. We're looking at FDA. We're looking at you. How do we get to the point of treatments? Patient community is getting upset. Would not take much of a powder keg to get that community chaining itself to the fence at White Oak.
That's it.
Thank you.
Gary?
Good. This is good.
That's great.